We'll be covering Module 2, where we'll discuss variables. So what are variables? Well, as we discussed in Module 1, a program requires data to be put into it, and it should produce some data. That's our input and output. But the data in a program must be stored and named so that it can be referred to in the program. So if we need to have the user input something, we need to have a name for where that data is going to be stored. So a variable is like a container. It's designed to store a particular data item, and the value stored may change or vary as the program runs. For example, if we have a variable that should contain the user's name, and the user has to type in their name in the program, if different users sit down and use that program, the name is going to be different every time because not every user will have the same name. But the names will all go in that same container or that variable each time the program is run. Naming a variable is a method of identifying that particular storage location. So instead of having to figure out exactly where in the computer this information is stored and refer to it in some computer language code that we don't really understand as humans, we have variables which allow us to name something with a meaningful name. So we can type in whatever name we want for a variable within certain rules. For one thing, you cannot have any spaces in a variable name. So if you do include more than one word, you'll notice the last point on this slide is camel case can be used to separate words. So camel case is where the first word is not capitalized, but whatever words you use after that will have a capital first letter. And that just helps it to be easier to read because you can tell where one word ends and the next begins, but you cannot have any spaces in variable names. So that's the main rule as far as the names you can choose. However, best practice is to make all names meaningful and choose names that describe the type of data that is stored. So if you're trying to store a user's phone number, you might name the variable phone number. You want to avoid names that are not specific, like variable 1. Because remember, you are naming this variable to help yourself and any other programmers that might work on your program. But when you look back at your code, you want to make sure that the variables tell you what they're there for. What are they storing and how are they being used in this program? So our pictures on the screen kind of give us a real life example. So we have several containers in these pictures, and they are labeled according to what they store. So you have a container for dog toys, you have a container for dog treats, and you have a container for dog food. So when you look at a container like that and you have a label on it, you expect it to contain whatever the label says is in there. So in dog toys, we see there's dog toys. And then with the dog treats and dog food, we see that those labels describe what is inside that container. Now, you might change the specific thing that is in that container. So maybe you choose to buy your dog some different type of treat or a different type of food. If you put that in the container, the contents are a little bit different, but it is still the same type of thing. It still falls under that label. So this is just like variables. Variables are also containers. The name of the variable should describe what is inside that variable, what data is in that variable. The data itself might change. So with the phone number, maybe each user has a different phone number, and so that the content of that variable will change, but the name stays the same, and it always refers to where that information is stored on the computer. The other part to assigning variables is data types. So A key thing that you'll find later on is that you have to declare a variable before you can actually use it, which means that you are naming it and assigning a data type to it. So basically, it's a step in the program where you are telling the program, this variable exists and I want to name it this, and it should have this data type. The point of data types is to define what kind of data can be stored in a variable in a more specific way. So you have integers, which are whole numbers. These can be positive, negative, or zero. Examples would be numbers like 3, 576, or -5. Real is also numbers, but these numbers can include a decimal point. So examples might be 19.2, 0.547, -1.5. String is where you can use letters or special characters like A, B, $. It's important to choose the right data type because it determines how those pieces of data can be used. So if you need to calculate something using numbers, you would want to choose integer or real. Which one you choose depends on whether you need decimals or not. So if you're performing a calculation using financial data that's going to include dollars and cents, then you would need to choose real because that will include the decimal point and will be more accurate. If you are using text, letters, special characters, whatever, you would choose string. Now, you can store numbers in a string data type. However, you cannot use them in a calculation if you have that variable defined as a string. Those numbers would not be able to be used in a calculation. Once you declare a variable, you can assign a value to it 3 different ways. You can get input from a user, so have the user type something in. You can perform a calculation for integer and real data types. So again, with numbers, you can create a variable, a container for data, and you can calculate a value using other variables that already have values stored in them. Or finally, you can assign a text value or combine text with user input for character string data types. So in this case, you would be assigning some sort of text value, basically saying this variable equals this text value. So these variables and how to use variables will start making more sense as we move into actually writing some code. But for now, just focus on how do we name variables. So think of them like these containers. How do we name them based on what information is going to be stored in that variable? And then what type of data should we define as going in that variable? Should it be an integer, whole numbers? Should it be real, numbers with a decimal point? Or should it be string, which includes letters or special characters? So focus on that, just how we would define those variables, name them so that we can tell what's being stored and what type of data those variables should contain.